Excellent. So I think we'll begin. I'd like to say a very warm welcome to everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon in the UK and from many time zones I can see. I will start off by introducing our panel for today's event. And I think you should be able to see all of us here in the room with our videos on. I'm Niki Mardas. I'm the Executive Director of Global Canopy, the host of today's webinar. I'm joined by my colleague Emma Thomson, who leads our tracking program, including the Forest 500 and now the Deforestation Action Tracker, which we will be introducing you today. I'm delighted to have José Pugas joining us, a partner and head of ESG at JGP Asset Management from Brazil. José, great to have you with us. We've got Jonathan Gorman. Many of you will know Jonathan, Technical Director at Efeca, and has been involved in this space for a very long time, including advising on matters financial. And it's superb to have Alex Reid with us. Alex is the Senior Global Policy Advisor on Deforestation of Finance at Global Witness, and a very close GFANZ watcher. So we'll be hearing from all three of our panelists, and of course Emma to present our results shortly. If I may just give some very quick housekeeping. Please do use the Q&A box for questions. We're going to have plenty of time for questions at the end of the webinar. Do throw stuff in there whenever you like. The chat box is open. We welcome conversation there. We're going to have a poll coming up a little bit later too, which will ask you to participate. And finally, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared with you shortly afterwards. So with that, I might offer a few short introductory remarks. As I say, a few more people have joined in the interim. So again, I'm delighted to welcome you all to the launch of Global Canopy's new Deforestation Action Tracker. This is a simple initiative to help increase accountability and to help accelerate progress on an urgent and so far intractable problem: the trillions of dollars in private finance that continue to power global deforestation. A year ago, in one of COP26's moments of big promise, the Glasgow Finance Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ to its friends, brought together more than 130 trillion worth of assets, that number has gone up, in committing to achieve net zero by 2050. And a few weeks ago, the GFANZ leadership, Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg, and Mary Shapiro, put out a striking statement on tackling deforestation, bringing it front and center as a priority for this group. Realistically, they wrote, the world will not reach net zero by 2050 unless we halt and reverse deforestation within a decade. And they also wrote that transition plans that lack objectives and clear targets to eliminate and reverse deforestation are incomplete. And indeed, many of you will know that the GFANZ transition guidance was published just yesterday. It makes for a good read. It features deforestation as a core pillar, again, for reaching net zero. So our new Deforestation Action Tracker, in its simplest terms, you can think of as a perfect counterpart to these GFANZ statements. It will help to increase transparency and accountability for action on deforestation for the more than 550 financial institutions that have made significant climate commitments. That includes, but is not limited to, GFANZ, of course, and the Race to Zero and others. We'll have more to come from the panel on the recent decoupling of the two initiatives. And it's also an initiative that can help support and enable those financial institutions in targeting their actions to capitalize on this huge opportunity represented by transitioning away from deforestation in their investment and lending. So we hope that over time, this initiative will really provide financial institutions themselves with data that can help focus their actions and fill gaps. Over the last 2 months, Emma Thomson, who you'll hear from shortly, and her team have been through literally tens of thousands of public statements and reports. Thank you, Emma, for a very thorough and quick job to establish a baseline review of action on deforestation for 557 financial institutions that have made these climate commitments. I mean, the first results, Emma will take us through in more detail, but in a nutshell, they're really what we have come to expect. In the main, underwhelming, some bright spots of impressive action by financial institutions that clearly mean business on deforestation, and a few lowlights that took even us as seasoned watchers by surprise. But we see this as a starting line. This initiative worries less about what didn't happen yesterday and far more about what does happen tomorrow. What matters now is rapid and transparent progress from this baseline, not just by the few dozen leaders who are already making real progress and creating guide rails for all who will follow, but across the finance sector as a whole. Next year and in each subsequent year after that, we will deepen this data set by undertaking more detailed, comprehensive assessments and peer rankings for all these financial institutions, not just to identify who has or hasn't put in place the objectives and targets on deforestation that the GFANZ co-chairs have called for, but also scoring the strength in coming years and the comprehensiveness of those targets to ensure, for instance, that human rights impacts that are inextricably linked, as we know, to deforestation are being accounted for. And critically, identifying who is actually implementing their policies and beginning to help move the needle on this problem. So for financial institutions coming new to this issue, as many will be, we know it can seem complex. It is complex, but if you're following, but you are following a well understood pathway, as we'll hear, I'm sure, from our panelists. After over a decade of collective effort across sectors, there is now, there are a number of assets available. There's freely available guidance on the steps for financial institutions to follow, aligned with best practice and aligned with the assessment methodology to be used next year. That and all the other resources I mentioned, you can find linked to in the report published today. Secondly, there's better data on company risk than ever before, and more to come, both as technologies improve and new legislation leads to more corporate disclosure, as we expect. That's not to say the data is perfect, a lot more work to be done, but we see time and time again financial institutions saying there's enough to move now and it's getting better. And thirdly, we have leading financial institutions sharing case studies, illustrating their own journeys, and helping to develop tool sets to ease the pathways for others that follow. And again, I mean, I'm sure we'll hear from Pugas a little bit on his experiences at JGP in a short while. Action on deforestation is genuinely one of the great no-brainers of our time. For progress on climate change, which we've already discussed, for protecting biodiversity, addressing impacts on nature and the web of associated risks to people, economies, businesses, and for ending the violence and rights abuses that are the daily companions of the deforestation that all of us, through our lives, continue to finance around the world. It's also a growing source of risk for the private sector. Financial risk, with a recent report by the high-level climate champions predicting an average 7% loss in value for the global agribusiness sector by 2030 due to unpriced nature and climate risks related to land, huge financial benefits from rapid action on deforestation, but also growing legislative risk from emerging laws coming into place in major consumer markets. And I know that that's something we'll hear more about from our fantastic panel. So I'll stop there and thank you again for being with us today. And to start with a deeper dive into the Deforestation Action Tracker and the findings that have been published, I'm very pleased to introduce my colleague, Emma, who leads this initiative. Emma, over to you.
Thanks, Niki. And yeah, thank you again to everyone for joining us to hear more about the findings of this baseline review. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So as Niki said, this year, 557 financial institutions were included in the baseline review as part of the Deforestation Action Tracker. All 557 are members of GFANZ and or Race to Zero as of the end of June this year. And then in addition to being a member of one of these two parent initiatives, all of the financial institutions are also members of at least one of the 11 sub-initiatives that you can see on the screen that make up GFANZ and Race to Zero. So these initiatives are all there for you to see, but kind of some key examples would be the Paris-Aligned Investment Initiative, the Net Zero Banking Alliance, and the Net Zero Asset Manager Initiative. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. I wanted to provide a quick overview of how the baseline reviews were conducted this year. So the baseline reviews were conducted between the 1st of August and the 30th of September this year. So any publicly available information that was available on the websites of the 557 financial institutions was reviewed within this baseline review. All of the reviews were done in English as well as the native language of the country where the institution is headquartered. And a little bit more about the methodology itself. So all financial institutions were reviewed on their financial exposure to companies with a known high deforestation risk. And they were also reviewed on their existing action on deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses against best practice for the sector. And this was specifically in relation to the commodities which drive the majority of tropical deforestation, which are palm oil, soy, cattle products, so beef and leather, and then also timber products, so timber and pulp and paper. This review included 12 core indicators that were adapted from the 2022 Forest 500 financial institution methodology. And as this was a baseline review, no numerical scores were given to any of the financial institutions. So the answers to each indicator were recorded, of course, which is all available for you to download from our website right now. But first, I will go on to the findings of the review itself. I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. Of the 557 institutions, 17% publicly acknowledged that deforestation, conversion, or associated human rights abuses were a business risk to the institution itself. And this included financial, material, or reputational risks, with more than half of those that recognize deforestation as a risk, seeing that it is a financial risk. And as you can see on the second graph on the screen, where gray indicates yes, and purple indicates no, that 43% of those included in this review were participating in some kind of collaborative action or legislative advocacy related to deforestation. So it's really clear that these institutions see the value in working together to drive change, including on deforestation. And hopefully this collaboration will continue to help push forward progress within the finance sector. If I could have the next slide, please. The majority of the financial institutions reviewed, as Niki said, are at the starting line in terms of action on deforestation, notably with the deforestation policies. 20% of the financial institutions have set a commodity-specific deforestation policy for at least one of the 4 highest forest risk commodities. So as a reminder, that was palm oil, soy, beef and leather, and timber and pulp and paper. And 6% had a policy in place for all 4 commodities, which equates to 36 of the financial institutions. As the rest of the 557 financial institutions move forward from the starting line, setting comprehensive policies covering at least these 4 commodities is a really key step going forward. Next slide, please. We also reviewed financial institutions on their current action on human rights abuses, often associated with deforestation. So this included testing and respecting the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and respecting customary rights to land, resources and territory. As you can see, few financial institutions are setting such policies, while 15% of the institutions had set a policy for free, prior and informed consent for at least one of the commodities. As you can see, just 3% had a policy on the customary rights to land, resources and territory of Indigenous peoples and local communities, and just 0.5% had a zero tolerance policy for threats and violence against forest, land and human rights defenders. Addressing the human rights abuses linked to deforestation is vital in ensuring that deforestation itself is eliminated. Next slide, please. Thank you. We also looked at how financial institutions were implementing their policies in their portfolios, and in what is not unexpected in a baseline review with many of these institutions at the beginning of the journey towards being deforestation free, is that 3% of the institutions were reporting information about how they were implementing their commitments. And there were specific criteria that we were looking for this indicator, which are available in the methodology. But these 3% were reporting, which was great to see. And that kind of leadership and showing that they are making progress towards their commitments is really important. Next slide, please. Thank you. And to quickly look at one of the final parts of the baseline review methodology, which included looking at whether these financial institutions were financing companies with the highest exposure to deforestation risk. So this used Forest 500 and Forest and Finance data, but not information publicly available on the financial institutions' websites for this indicator. We were looking at a very specific group of companies that are known to have the highest deforestation risk. And we found that nearly 2/3 of the institutions in this group that we reviewed had a known exposure to these companies with a high exposure to deforestation risk through their supply chains. As this is a specific group of companies, this is likely to be an underestimate of their total exposure to deforestation risk, but it is a really useful indicator for this review. Next slide, please. Thank you. So as Niki said earlier, the Deforestation Action Tracker is designed to drive progress from the finance sector on deforestation, on conversion, and on associated human rights abuses. And as Niki also said, next year we'll be conducting full assessment of the institutions in alignment with the Forest 500 financial institution methodology. As we rapidly approach 2025, a key date where commodity-driven deforestation should be being eliminated by, we do need to see a step change in action from the majority of the institutions involved in this review. To support this progress, Global Canopy has set out some key recommendations. If I could have the next slide, please. Thank you. So for financial institutions themselves, in the next 12 months to make notable progress on deforestation and to help front load their progress towards their net zero commitments, we need to see more recognizing the role that deforestation plays in climate change, biodiversity loss, and human rights abuses. We also need to see them assessing their exposure to deforestation, conversion, and associated human rights abuses. Also setting strong public policies and committing to eliminating commodity-driven deforestation, conversion, and associated abuses by 2025. We also need to see commitments of monitoring and engaging clients for holdings to implement those policies, and also to use the guidance and the data that's available to help identify, address, and eliminate these risks and impacts. So really making the most of the resources to help drive change and also make the process easier for them as well. Next slide, please. But we do also need to see Race to Zero and GFANZ play a clearer role in encouraging their members to incorporate deforestation as they work towards their net zero commitments. As we've heard, in June, Race to Zero published leadership criteria on deforestation, and just yesterday, GFANZ published new guidance and recommendations in which deforestation prominently featured. But we also would like to see these initiatives set a clear expectation for all members to set strong deforestation policies that also cover land conversion and associated human rights abuses. Call for the initiatives which make up these coalitions set equivalent expectations of their members. And finally, to call for transparent reporting of progress towards these policies once they've been set. And by taking these steps, the finance sector can really move the needle on deforestation, and we'll be able to see how much progress has been made next year through the Deforestation Action Tracker's 2023 assessments. So yeah, thank you very much, and back to you, Niki.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot, Emma. I think there's a questions come in on some of the technical side of the assessments. Maybe we can come back to that in order to keep the momentum going and move to a poll now to bring in the wider audience and to hear your views. Athena, can we get the poll going? So it should be popping up. How can financial institutions be best encouraged to raise the bar? So we've got GFANZ guidance along the lines of what we saw come out yesterday. Race to zero criteria. We know that race to zero leadership criteria now include action on deforestation, collaborative shareholder action, so pressure from the outside, 2 points on legislation for companies and finance sector respectively. I'm sorry, you can't have them both. And others, yeah, please do share your thoughts in the chat box. We want to hear as many views as possible. Right, so I think we've got the results in. So let's see what we've got. Well, not too surprising. Legislation, I'm afraid, my friends, wins the day. Companies, and very interestingly for the finance sector. So I think Jonathan, Alex, maybe this is something you might like to pick up on when we come to you, but I think we might ask Pugas, joining us today from Brazil, where we've seen momentous changes. Can you, well, first of all, thanks again for being with us. And JGP have made very significant commitments to deforestation-free commitments over and above net zero commitments, with a COP commitment to 2025, eliminating deforestation from your portfolios by 2025. It would be great to hear a little bit from you about why you took this step, and what would you say to other financial institutions that are just starting out on this journey? What can they expect, and what have you found useful in JGP's journey?
Thank you, Nick. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start telling you that I totally agree with the results from the poll. So we are fair aligned with the perception of the majority. And not on this poll, but the poll on Sunday as well here in Brazil. So when you look at we are a very entirely different beast. We are a Brazilian-based asset manager. So we are on a commodity-based economy, that's like Brazil, and we are highly concentrated on investments in Brazil. So it's not, we just can't define to go away. We just can't go, okay, let's start investing in Europe or United States. We have to address Brazil. And in Brazil, over 40% of the global deforestation is based in Brazil. We are responsible by a large share of the global deforestation. But we are also the guardians of over 30% of all the reminiscent tropical forests in the world, 50% of the biodiversity. So we are on the front line of on how to tackle deforestation, to fight against deforestation. But it hasn't been easy. I will not say that it was. We have been living 4 years of total blackout of information. So we had to first engage with the companies to start prospecting informations and to make a decision on how to deal with deforestation. So when most of the companies, most of the asset managers started creating policies, evaluating their risks, and then engage with the companies, have to do the opposite, have to start engage with the companies to measure the impact and exposure to deforestation and co-create our policies with those companies. Mostly because when we are highly concentrated on a producing country such as Brazil, we can't just invent new companies. We have to help the companies to transition to conversion-free business models. So I think that the richest of our experience at JGP was that we were not demanding anything. We were inviting the companies, inviting our investors on this transition trajectory, being quite blunt on the obsolescence of our economy in Brazil if we don't do that work, if we don't perform that transition. So, at last, I think that one of the highlights of our experience is that when we are publishing the policies, we are also presenting some new funds, some economic alternatives. So we are not just saying that we are going to exclude companies. We are saying that the exclusion will happen based on a plan B, based on an exit plan that is on where the fixed income side caught in our strategy. So we are also helping companies with content, with leadership, with thoughts, with insights, but also with adapted funds for them to make.
So I'm afraid I've lost Pugas. I'm assuming I'm not the only one.
Lost for me too.
Okay, so thank you those who are sharing on the chat. So well, Pugas has opened up some important points on inviting in companies, being quite transparent, offering plan Bs, opportunities, new ways of looking at this. I do hope he'll be able to hear us again soon and come back to us. So we'll come back round to Pugas on his hopeful return. And in the meantime, I might turn then, Jonathan, to you. I mean, you've been involved in the business of cleaning up supply chains for a very long time. You've seen what's worked, what hasn't worked for companies. You've helped advise the UK government on finance sector action. What do you think of what you've heard today in this new initiative? Oh, muted still, I think, Jonathan.
Look at that. There's always one on the presentation, isn't it? Jose is back, so I don't know.
Oh, well,
Yes.
yeah.
I wasn't hacked. I wasn't hacked.
Good to know, Pugas, and it's good to have you back. Do you want to round out your thought? We were about to move to Jonathan, but great to have you back, and maybe you could briefly round out your thoughts.
Yes, for sure. I was quite at the end, I think, and it's just that we can't lose the investor. We have to provide information, provide a certainty for our investors, our incumbent capital, that the transition will not be harmful. And we also have to be appealing for the international investor. I think that from 2023 on will be a return of the international capital flow into Brazil. But we need to know which kind of capital we want to flow back to Brazil. For sure, it will be the capital that is committed on tackling deforestation, on preserving human rights. So we need to create new products, new financial mechanisms to be welcoming to those investors and be quite didactic on presenting this new reality to our incumbent capital at JGP. We are a 25 years old company, so imagine that all of our capital started to invest on us when there was an ESG or such concern. On making this transition is essential.
Yeah, thank you so much, Pugas. These are such important points. I'm sure they'll generate questions. A very quick follow-up for you. I mean, for those that might be listening to this, financial institutions ready to step in, worried about some of the data challenges, what would you say to them? I know that you and other financial institutions have shared some of your investor expectations on companies, so you've been able to share some joint resources for those that want to make progress. Do you have any quick message for financial institutions that are taking the leap now?
Yes, for sure. If we at JGP, who is extremely exposed to those high-risk assets, we took a step further and said that it was possible. I think that for any other financial institution is possible as well. The data will not be perfect, will not be precise, but the data is already available. We have to, for sure, develop a better strategy when the data gets better. And the data will get better, will be improved, but we can't just wait. We can't use the lack of data or the lack of security with the data to postpone, to procrastinate our decision making. So let's start as soon as possible with what we have on our hands, and being quite sure that this process will be evolutionary. We are starting now and we're going to improve with the time, but we can't just wait.
Yeah, Pugas, thank you very much for your thoughts and for your exhortation to everybody. Jonathan, back to you. We've done a little intro, and so straight in if you like.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody. Thanks for the invite. I think the results of the deforestation tracker kind of mirror some of the evidence that the GRI task force, the Global Resource Initiative task force, looked at, and was one of the reasons why it came to the conclusion that it did earlier the year. And interestingly, those poll results that you've just shown there, again, would mirror some of the conclusions that the task force came to about what would be the best levers for ensuring that finance also takes some of the action that we see in supply chain companies. So perhaps I could just take a couple of minutes just to talk through the kind of recommendations of the GRI task force and why they came to that conclusion about the need for sort of legislation. So just as a bit of a background, it was March this year that the GRI task force submitted a report to the UK government, basically with recommendations for how mandatory due diligence should be and could be implemented for the finance sector in the UK. And by due diligence, just to be clear, I guess what we mean by that is FIs, financial institutions, putting in place systems to manage the risks that their investments or lending may be linked to deforestation or conversion, and importantly, to publicly disclose what actions they're going to take as a result of that. This was a recommendation actually that the task force made back in 2020, and the government, as we've seen in the UK, have acted upon that in relation to supply chain companies. So the Environment Act 2021 will be, when that fully comes into force, will be requiring supply chain companies to take action. But that Environment Act doesn't include finance. And so that's what the task force was aiming to look at. How do you implement mandatory due diligence within legislation for finance? We looked at some evidence. You made some compelling, put some compelling evidence out there in Forest 500 last year, and it's mirrored in the results you've got here in terms of the fact that the majority of FIs are not taking action on deforestation, and yet the financial risk is there. The task force looked at climate, interestingly, looked at the growing kind of awareness of the material of financial risks that FIs have associated with investment in fossil fuels. It looked at the policy agenda, which in the UK is increasingly about mandatory disclosure and mandatory enforcement of transparency, and thought these were great, these were compelling, lots of activity on climate. TCFD, TNFD, all those kind of things. But in the end, I think what the task force came to the conclusion was that the pathway of mandatory disclosure on climate risk just isn't sufficient to tackle the kind of unique problems that relate to deforestation and financial flows. Certainly not at the scale and the pace that we need, for lots of reasons. Partly, in part because the kind of investment in fossil fuels, the reputational risk and material risk associated with that are well known, well understood, and increasingly impactful. But I don't think those material risks exist right now or are well understood enough in relation to forest risk commodities. So I guess the task force recognised that whilst there are leaders in finance on forests and GAGP, you've kind of demonstrated that leadership. You can't act alone. And we've seen that in supply chains. Many big food companies in the UK have supported and encouraged the government to step up and put mandatory due diligence in because they cannot act on their own. You need a level playing field, and that's what regulation can do. And also, somebody coined the phrase in the task force, we need a regulatory cliff edge. You need a strong signal that starts to shift capital away from unsustainable production. And that's a really important signal which finance needs. And although this sounds all very punitive, in the end, it was felt by the task force that this would put UK FIs in a much stronger position, to manage the risks to their investments, to front load their kind of plans on net zero transition, because scope 3 emissions are really important to that. So the two things that the GRI task force said were important, and the steps it should take, is step one, require of FIs the same as we're going to require of supply chain companies. In other words, make it illegal for FIs to invest or lend to companies that aren't able to demonstrate they're acting legally, that aren't able to demonstrate the commodities are being sourced legally. And in essence, what we're saying is ask the same of financial institutions as you're asking of supply chain companies. And indeed, it would be a bit perverse to allow FIs to benefit from investment or lending in activities linked to illegal deforestation, when the law in the UK will prohibit supply chain companies to do the same. And the second stage is to build on that and extend the legislation to ask not only FIs but supply chain companies to ensure that the commodities that they use or invest in are not just avoiding illegality, but also are sustainable. So that brings in legal deforestation as well. So those are the two steps. Firstly, match what we're asking of UK companies. And remember, we expect that the Environment Act will require those supply chain companies to publish what they're doing, how they're acting, what their due diligence activities are. So in terms of data, it should be possible and easier for FIs to see which of the UK companies they're investing in or lending to are actually compliant with the law. In 2 years' time, that data will be available, so you can see that. So I think that two-step process was felt reasonable and pragmatic, set that regulatory cliff edge, but ultimately corporate, finance, government ambitions on climate and deforestation are not going to be met unless finance sector to step up, and obviously supply chain companies step up as well. So that ultimately is kind of what we're trying to achieve here. But that two-step process it was felt by the task force to be the right approach. That's what went into government, and I think perhaps people on this webinar maybe consider that to be a sensible approach. Not just finance, but finance and supply chain. It needs to be involved in this regulatory package. I shall stop there.
Fantastic. That's incredibly helpful. And we've got a couple of questions already in the Q&A box on this issue of legislation. So maybe I'll come back to you on one or two of those. But I think maybe just to make sure everyone's heard first, Alex, over to you. I mean, we're seeing a lot more attention on these issues, that's for sure. I've been talking to financial institutions on these questions for over a decade, and we've seen a huge uptick in interest and activity. But still, recent research, Forest and Finance Coalition and others show we're seeing more investment, not less, more lending coming into high-risk companies. How do we get stronger accountability, and what do you make of what you've heard today?
Absolutely. Well, we're heading into the COP for implementation, as this Egyptian presidency is calling it. And I think that holding GFANZ members accountable to their commitments is more important, more pressing than ever. But it's also more uncertain than ever, because as GFANZ watchers will know, the Alliance recently announced, and you guys have spoken about this a little bit in your presentations, that it is no longer mandatory for partners to follow the independent criteria that was being set by the UN's Race to Zero. And for civil society, that's a really concerning development, particularly because that split came ahead of Race to Zero's introduction of an independent compliance mechanism that was intended to bolster the monitoring of performance against pledges. And it's really very unclear now who or what will monitor if GFANZ members are making progress against their targets. GFANZ itself says that it's now up to the subsector alliances, but we would certainly question if that's appropriate, particularly considering the failure of so many voluntary initiatives that have been run by the private sector in the past. And so really the question is, with these goals being so urgent, can the financial sector definitely mark its own homework? And so I really massively welcome this report from Global Canopy. I think it's a much needed assessment of where GFANZ members are in the first year into their net zero pledges. I'm particularly impressed by how quickly and well you've conducted the assessment. It feels like actually you guys have stepped into the vacuum that's been created by GFANZ effectively separating from UN Race to Zero. But I'm also, obviously, like many others on this call, extremely dismayed by what the results show, even just from the policy perspective. And as you've said there, Niki, you know, at the end of the day, policies are just one half of the story. Perhaps what really matters more than anything is where that capital is actually flowing to. And so Global Witness's research, released ahead of COP last year, showed that financial institutions in the UK, EU, US and China netted 1.74 billion financing just 20 agribusinesses engaged in deforestation between 2015 to 2020. And so we'll be releasing another finance paper on Finance Day, 9th of November at COP this year, which will demonstrate that very little has changed in terms of where that capital is actually flowing, as well as your assessment of the policies of GFANZ members.
Thank you very much, Alex. I mean, maybe you could just say a little bit. We're agreeing on the problem, on the gap. What are the practical solutions that you see?
Absolutely. Well, from my perspective, the solution clearly isn't found in existing regulation. Otherwise, you wouldn't have been talking to financial institutions about this for the past 10 years. And that's some real tenacity and determination to keep going. I actually come from the anti-money laundering policy world, and I wish that those frameworks worked well enough to capture deforestation, because we know that 2/3 of agricultural commodity production is illegal, according to some very reputable research. But the reality is that deforestation is not a priority crime from an anti-money laundering perspective. And the second thing to say is that we haven't so far really found any hope in voluntary initiatives. You only need to look at the scale of deforestation financing and the fact that so few financial institutions in GFANZ have a policy to see that previous pledges haven't worked. So what can we do to keep the world on track for 1.5 degrees? New legislation, as Jonathan concluded in his cross-sector task force, is absolutely needed to introduce due diligence to stop the financial sector from bankrolling routine deforesters. The deforestation target that was set by Race to Zero in June this year was to achieve deforestation-free value chains by 2025. And the GFANZ leader statement that you referenced earlier that was released in September pushes that back to the end of the decade. So we really can't afford to have that constant sliding back within voluntary initiatives again. I think what's true of both of those dates is that they feel extremely imminent. We're really approaching a tipping point. And so our campaign and the work of Jonathan and the GRI task force isn't a reflexive reach for legislation, but a very informed cross-sector perspective too. And so I hope we've convinced the other 51% of the people on the call that that's what's needed.
Thank you very much, Alex. Yeah, and as you say, either way, it's imminent. And I think our insight, because we're very much working in all our work trying to support and enable action. So, we offer our support to all those that can benefit from it. We've got stepwise guidance out there that you can freely access and we can talk to you about. But I think the key really is that the stepwise approach is critical. It's not trying to get everything done in one block. It needs starting today to hit these targets that are later than we'd like, but nevertheless are ambitious given where we currently are. So I think I'm going to move us into a Q&A session. I am going to come back. I mean, there's been a lot of talk about legislation. And I think we'll come back to this topic in the questions. But to give us a little change of tempo and scene, Emma, I might come back to you very briefly. I mean, we've got a few technical questions. I don't think these are to be answered really in depth. Maybe you could give quick fire answers or put some answers in the chat. But I do know you're going to have a more detailed webinar for financial institutions that would like to participate and hear more and ask more questions about the methodology. But to give you a sampling, we got a question about what are the criteria in the methodology for a company to be called high risk, for instance. That's come through. There's a question there about parent companies and how you look at parent companies versus child companies. And yeah, any others that you've seen on methodology that you might just give us some quick answers and we can invite people back to the more technical webinar that you're planning.
Yeah, absolutely. I hope my audio is a bit better now, but we'll see. So in terms of the parent and subsidiary relationship, so as a blanket view, all of the financial institutions were reviewed at the level at which they signed their net zero commitment or became a member of Race to Zero or GFANZ. But we did also review their parent financial institution if they were the ultimate parent, and then we selected the strongest policy from either the subsidiary or the parent, provided that the parent policy applied to the subsidiary, to ensure that we were getting a true picture of their baseline action on deforestation. In terms of the definition of high-risk companies, so there's more detail in the methodology document on our website, but for Forest 500, it's the 350 companies that have the greatest exposure to deforestation risk through their commodity sourcing, specifically of palm oil, soy, beef, leather, timber, and pulp and paper. But yes, there's more detail in the methodology, which Athena has just posted in the chat there as well.
Brilliant, thank you very much. So maybe I can just turn to Jonathan, perhaps briefly back to you. We've heard a lot about legislation. We've got a couple of questions here about EU legislation proposed to include financial institutions. What does that mean in practice? I mean, you've talked a little bit about financial institutions in the UK context. There's also a question there about addressing deforestation in instances where governments, well, maybe we could give that to Pugas, but Jonathan, why don't we start with that question? What would these laws mean in practice? Oh, mute again, I think.
Apologies. Yeah, I mean, it's something that the GRI task force spent a lot of time also thinking about. How do you structure a bit of legislation? And we did actually spend some time looking, as Alex talked about, with the anti-money laundering legislation. And is there a structure within that we could use? Because, you know, speaking to a number of FIs, when you look inside their organizations at the resources that they would put to anti-money laundering, you find some big teams, and you have some very clever and complicated systems with algorithms that filter out funding requests, clients, and can identify, you know, for example, a sector, an area where you would then kind of filter that particular request or that client or whatever else and say, okay, that needs a bit more examination. We need to ask a set of questions when we come across a company within a particular sector. So there are ways and you know, examples that we can use and that are existing, and systems that are existing in companies, in banks, in you know, in other FIs that you know, develop. And sometimes that's what legislation does. It forces a lot of the data and the tools and the systems to be developed that enable companies to be able to assess their risks and then begin to narrow them down, because it is complex. These are long, complex, sometimes opaque supply chains, but we've got companies that are ultimately investing in these and more information available. And I think that in practice, that's what will be developed by finance institutions to enable them to break down a very long set of supply chains and big portfolios to be able to say, that's where my risk is, that's where I need to focus. And as you said, there are loads and lots of resources for them to be able to then say, okay, how do I measure the performance of a global trader? How do I know whether they're acting at the proportionate, you know, to the proportionate risk and to the proportionate speed and scale? How do I compare that against best practice and say, I am right to continue to invest in that company? Because, you know, we don't want the obvious reaction, which is complete risk averse and everybody just pulls out of these sectors. But, you know, we've got lots of experience of that within supply chains. You stay engaged, you look at the information, you make a judgment, you hold people accountable for that, and then you monitor and report. And these are not, you know, these are systems that FIs are well attuned to, and we've seen it in anti-money laundering, and it can happen within the sphere of deforestation as well. And the legislation hopefully will make that easier for them to do that, because we in the UK and in the EU hopefully will have a register, and there will potentially be an annual report saying this is what this company has done, this is how they are being measured against the legislation. There's the first place that an FI could look to say, should I be investing in that company anymore?
Thank you very much. That's a very, very clear answer. Maybe Pugas, we could come to you. I mean, a lot of the legislation that Jonathan and Alex have been talking about is in consumer markets. We've talked about the EU and the UK. We've got a question here about addressing deforestation in instances where governments not only deregulate but also seem to heavily promote activities that cause deforestation. What's your take on these moves to legislate that you've seen in the EU and elsewhere, and how would you answer that question?
Great question. I can say that I know some countries that incentivize deforestation, but First of all, we have to understand that the legislation is extremely important. And when we talk about producing countries and consumer countries, we are intrinsically connected. Most of the movements that were pushed, many of the pressure that we have applied on the government, on even the current government in Brazil, to change legislations were accelerated thanks to the European Union legislation, because we are connected. When a consumer country defines that they will not more finance or import commodities or final products based on deforestation, we have to change our legislation in Brazil. We have to change the behavior of our economy. Otherwise, there's not just a question of being a political pariah, but also economic pariah. And nobody wants to be disconnected from flow of capital and flow of trade. So the legislation, once we have this, once we had this opportunity to start talking to the producers with the sector, agricultural sector in Brazil, about the existential risk of not being compliant with the EU legislation, with the UK legislation, and the UK, please pass the not only illegal deforestation, but also legal deforestation. It will help us a lot to start pressuring our legislators and our lobby groups. Because those lobby groups are real, they exist, and they will start changing their behavior, not just saying for the government to procrastinate any kind of legislation that would forbid deforestation, but on the opposite, they will start demanding the government to pass legislations, pass laws to forbid deforestation, because they would want to level the field. Imagine that, for example, animal protein in Brazil. 28% of our animal protein in Brazil is based on free companies. We can pressure their listed companies. We can make a huge pressure on them. But the long tail of the other 72% is constituted by over 1,000 meatpacking companies that have no way to pressure them. Only the legislation can do that. And for those free companies, for those free meatpacking companies, they want those laws to pass. They want to make it happen because it will protect them from any kind of commercial use of those 1,000 companies that are not sensitive to international legislation. They're just limited by national regulation. So we have to give this systemic overview. It's a holistic approach. When you do something in Europe, it would help us in Brazil. But you need to say to those, we need to clarify that only international legislations will not work, because what would happen is to accelerate the extinction of competitiveness of responsible companies on producing countries. Imagine that if those free companies, those free meatpacking companies, stop purchasing from legal deforestation. Those other 1,000 companies that couldn't care less will start purchasing and occupying market share. It's terrible for our economy. It's terrible for deforestation as well. So you have to be smarter and start thinking how we are not just intrinsically connected on legislation, but also on solution. It's not just a question of creating nature-based solutions. It's a question of creating a nature-based economy. It's a much tougher challenge for us in Brazil, but it's a challenge that we have to face.
Thanks, Pugas. It's so great to hear both of you, and very thought-provoking. Time has rushed by, so I really want now to give Alex the final word. Alex, there's a lot to pick up on there. There's a couple of questions in the Q&A you'll have seen. Does the panel think that stop ecocide law could help end deforestation? Where does that fit as a different type of new law? Article 5 of the Paris Agreement. There's a question there on illegal deforestation, and somebody asked clarification on that. We've got just 2 or 3 minutes left, but over to you, Alex, to round us out, and then I'll just do a little bit of housekeeping at the end.
Yeah, I mean, the one in the chat that I would love to answer is around GFANZ is going to bring in a net zero data public utility, which is a really important concept. It will be an open source platform, so for financial institutions, for other actors who can't afford necessarily access to Refinitiv and lots of other financial databases, or don't quite know how to use those, including in civil society. That will be a great resource. But what I would say to that is that is not a monitoring and accountability strategy, because data doesn't hold financial institutions accountable. Governments do, and it shouldn't be the responsibility of civil society to go out and conduct this type of due diligence and provide the types of reports that NGOs like Global Witness frequently do to financial institutions that show that actually all of this information is open source and readily available. So I think it's really important to champion the public data utility and the open source nature of that, but not to use it as an excuse for not introducing legislation or to kind of kick the can down the road. And I think the other thing that I would really love to respond to is around deforestation for internal consumption. That is undoubtedly a huge amount of the market. If you actually look at beef production, for example, much of that finance is being ploughed in for commodities that are produced for domestic consumption. But that's just another area where José has said so perfectly that we can stem the flow of the finance. And that's why it's so important to have commensurate laws for finance and for supply chains, because just working on the importation of goods is not going to solve the global deforestation challenge. And it's not going to minimize Europe or the USA or China's contribution to deforestation to the fullest extent possible.
What a great roundup, Alex. Thank you. That's expertly done, all of you. I'm very grateful. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure this has been very well received by all. There are some more questions. We covered a lot of them. There are some more, of course, as always. Some written answers there as well that hopefully viewers have found useful. I think with that, I'm going to thank our panel very much. I'm going to thank the audience and remind you that you can read the report and baseline review results on the Global Canopy website. We've put the links in the chat box. The financial institutions that have been assessed are invited to another webinar next week. You should have received a note about that. Emma's mentioned it on the 8th of November. Any questions on that or anything else, we'd absolutely love to continue this dialogue, to hear from you. Please write us at tracking@globalcanopy.org. You see Emma's, not Emma's email, it's the tracking email. And as we mentioned at the beginning, a recording of the webinar will be shared within the next few days. There is going to be a survey magically pop up at the end. We'd be very grateful for your answers to that survey. But above all, thank you for your participation. Thank you to the excellent panelists, and Emma, for all your hard work and your team's hard work, and Athena and all those that have made this webinar possible today. Many thanks.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.